When I sat down to record this video, I was supposed to do an unboxing of my Spellbinders hot foil kit of the month, create some hot foil pieces, and then make a project. Only my hot foil machine broke. So what is a crafter to do when your machine goes down in the middle of a crafty session? That's what we're talking about today. Welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. So instead of giving up on my crafty session, I got experimental. I'm going to show you plenty of ways that you can use hot foil products without a hot foil machine. Some tried and true ways that I knew would work, and some very experimental ways that had mixed results. I'm going to keep it real, and at the very end I have a hack for you on how you can hot foil without a hot foil machine. To start from the beginning, here is my hot foil plate from Spellbinders. It's semi-wintry, it kind of looks like a snowy background, but it's got stars and hearts and polka dots, so it really can be used for anything. There's a couple of sentiments, and of course the hot foil, which we will play with in unusual ways a little bit later. But we're going to start with the actual hot foil product. I got as far as creating the sentiment pieces, and that is when my hot foil machine died. It just wouldn't get hot anymore. So I grabbed some supplies and got to work on other ideas. My first way is tried and true, and that is dry embossing with a die cut machine. I've done dry embossing with regular dies, and I have a cheat sheet for the sandwich to use in my machine for dry embossing. I'm going to lighten up the sandwich just a little bit to work on these hot foil plates because they are just a little bit thicker. And if you've never embossed with your dies before, I'll quickly go over the idea of the sandwich. So we're going to have a bottom plate for our machine, and then we're going to have the rubbery plate. That's the purple that you see there. And you want to make sure that you put the pattern on your plate facing the rubber mat. Now normally I would have a plastic shim and then my top plate to finish my sandwich, but I'm using a thinner metal shim instead of that plastic shim. And when I run it through my machine, it will push that impression down into the cardstock. And I'll say this again later, but right now I am using a very thick mixed media paper, and I'll show you the difference on what it looks like on a standard 80-pound cardstock later in the video. Next up, we're going to do faux letterpress, which is very much related to the dry embossing. Instead of just running it through the machine as a dry emboss, I'm going to ink up the plate first before I run it through. I find that this works with just about any ink, although I do need to run it through twice to get a good impression, and you'll notice that my paper is on a tape hinge, so I just align it with the edge of the plate, I tape it in place, and that will keep it both from slipping and smearing, as well as being able to allow me to close it up for a second run through the machine. You do have to be a bit careful when you are inking. You can see that in the background I got ink down on the base of the plate, and that will make an imperfect image when you run this through your machine. I'm using a foam-based ink pad. If you use a felt-based ink pad, you may have better results. You'll see a little bit of that later, but really a light touch is what you're going for here. And it all depends on your plate as well, because if you have a denser pattern to your impression, the ink pad won't have as much room to reach down to the base of the plate. So just experiment and try a very light hand. And here is what it looks like after just that first pass through the machine. I get it lined back up and make sure it's taped in place, and I go ahead and ink it up for a second pass. And once that's run through the machine, we have a nice, dark, crisp image, and I'm satisfied with that. And if you've never done this before, cleaning up these plates is really easy. Just a spray of water and a wipe with a rag, and you are done. Let's move on to a technique that I call ink coating. I honestly don't know if there's a better name for this technique out there in the world, but that's what I call it, so I'm going to go with it. And this is going to utilize that dry embossed panel, and we can do this in a couple of different ways. We can do it with the letterpress version or just with the dry emboss version. So I cut my letterpress piece in half, and I actually have a less than perfect letterpress piece because I got some ink in the background, and this is great to use this ink coating technique. I'm going to do one half of this panel on the letterpressed side, and this technique requires a brayer. This is not ink blending, this is ink coating, using that brayer to apply that ink and coat your paper. If you were to use a blending brush with this, the ink would get down into those debossed impressions and just cover up the imagery that is down there. Especially if you use the faux letterpress, you can see the difference in ink color between your ink coat and the faux letterpress ink, and that is going to make your image pop in a whole new way. So pardon Miss Willow there who came to craft with me today, but if I give you a close-up look at this paper, you will see that we have a little bit of a white halo around that debossed letterpressed part of the image. And that is because as the paper squishes that image down into the paper, it creates this little ramp, and the ink brayer can't reach that ramp. And that's why you get that halo effect. We'll look at the difference of that on 80-pound cardstock in a moment, but I just wanted to show you that it may look a little blotchy at first. See, on the right is fresh ink, but once it's dry, like the one on the left, it really does smooth out a lot better. And of course, that depends on the ink you're using. Some inks are better than others. So I am using this same thick mixed media paper to do the ink coating without the letterpress version. This is just the dry emboss version. And because of that ramp that I mentioned, your images don't pop as well, and honestly, I didn't like this one at all, so I wouldn't do this one again, but it really depends on the imagery that you have on your plate. So try and experiment with your plates to see if you get a look that you like. Now let's go ahead and compare it to an 80-pound cardstock. I'm currently using the scrapbook.com mixed media paper, but the 80-pound cardstock that I have is the Hammermill 80-pound cardstock. And I ran it through my machine with a letterpress style, just as I did with the mixed media paper. And here I'm doing kind of an ombre ink coating, but let me show you the comparison. On the right is the 80-pound paper, and on the left is the thick mixed media paper. And there is less haloing on that right-hand side. I hope you can tell the difference on film. Don't forget when you're doing this to experiment with your colors of ink and even your colors of cardstock, as you'll see. Here I did that ombre ink coating. Here I used 3 different colors of ink to do the faux letterpress. This one is the same 3 different colors, but I did zones instead of more of a stripe. This one I did distress ink on a colored cardstock. Here is a white pigment ink on a colored cardstock. So this one is kind of tennis ball-y yellow cardstock with a darker green ink. Now we have the opposite of ink coating, and I call that ink highlighting. Again, there may be another name for this, but that's the word I use. And this is going to use the opposite side of your dry emboss paper, and that is the side where the imagery is raised up off the surface. And you're going to use that to your advantage to try and just skim the surface of those images with some ink and highlight those images with that color. I will admit that I am very imperfect at this technique. I was using a brayer because I thought it would be more successful. You can try with a straight ink pad. Either way, I find that the ink often dips below the surface and leaves streaks on that background. And this again depends on the density of the images. If you have like a tight plaid, you'll have more luck with it than where I have this kind of smattering of images on there. Now I did try to tape my image down to the surface to make it lay flatter, because when you run it through the die cut machine, it takes on some natural warp, which can lead to more inconsistency with your inking. But here you can see, even with this flatter paper, I am getting streaks and striations, especially at the edge of that paper. So this technique doesn't work for me. I hope that maybe you have better luck with it. Next up is what is called pulling a print, and this is often used in the jelly print world. For our purposes, we could also call it stamping with our foil plates, but I'm going to leave it as the technical term of pulling a print, and we'll go with that. So you ink up your foil plate, you put your paper down on the surface, and then you apply pressure to transfer that print from the surface to your paper. And then you will pull your paper away from that surface, and that's where it gets its name from. So here is a first try at pulling this print, and it's very speckly and imperfect, but I have a way to make it better. The secret here is a sticky ink Like an embossing ink, I'm using Versamark in combination with your regular ink. So first I'm going to apply this Versamark down to my surface, and that is going to give this non-porous metal surface more grip for the ink. Water-based inks tend to bead up on non-porous surfaces, and that's what gives the speckly results. And that's why when we did the letterpress, we ran it through twice to get a better impression. The Versamark helps make the metal more porous, so to speak. It just gives it a texture for the ink to sit on. So when you go ahead and pull your print, you get a much crisper image than you would otherwise. And here is a bit of a comparison between the two. You can see our Versamark sticky ink on the right creates crisper images. And just for the keeping it real element of this video, I did try to take a pulled print off of a watercolored surface. I had ink on my surface already and I sprayed it down and it became a puddly mess. And I tried to pull a print off of it and I should have known better because it was just a puddly mess. So that didn't work at all. In fact, that last failure came from trying an ink lifting technique, and while this didn't work, at the end I want to say what may work. I didn't get a chance to try it, but let's walk through the process. So I wanted to really ink up the entire surface of this plate, and that is because when I was inking, I was getting smudges down below, and I thought, well, what if I just inked the whole dang thing and made it purposefully inky all across? And then I thought, well, if I've got it inky all across, why can't I just remove that surface layer from the image and kind of getting a tone on tone letterpress ink coating combo technique all in one pass? I know that sounds pretty confusing, but hopefully when you see what I'm going for in a minute, you'll be able to wrap your brain around it. All right, so here's where I'm lifting. I use the brayer to gently roll across the surface, and yes, it does lift off that ink. And I'm just putting the extra ink off on a scratch piece of paper. Now, it wasn't getting all the ink off, so I'm also washing my brayer. I don't know if that was really necessary. I think just a couple extra rolls on the paper may have been just fine. And I did that multiple times before running it through my machine to do the embossing impression. And here is what it looks like. Okay, I want to explain this now that you can see it. Hopefully you can see the difference in color between where the images are and where the background of the plate is. We've got a pink color where I've removed most of that reddish ink to give a lighter impression. So that worked. However, everything is super splotchy and that part was not successful. If I had done two things differently, I think I could have been satisfied with this technique. So the first thing I would do is use that Versamark ink, that sticky embossing ink, to ink up the entire plate. And we know that will prevent the beading problem and this splotchy look. And then instead of using a brayer to remove that layer of ink, I would pull several prints off of that plate and I will get not only the pulled prints to use as projects, it will also remove most of that ink to get that two-tone, tone-on-tone look to what I'm going for. I hope all of that makes sense. I know this is a bit of a confusing technique, and I know I didn't get it fully on camera to show you the process, but I wanted to put this out there just to show you how my experimentation goes in real life. Speaking of real life, I really wanted this heat embossing technique to work, and as you'll see, I do get it to kind of work a little bit later, but my first initial idea was to use this Versamark as you would on a stamp to do heat embossing, but because that ink is so sticky and the pad is so squishy, it was getting the Versamark ink everywhere, and it was causing my embossing powder to stick to everything. So I just called it at that moment saying, this is not going to work. However, that failure gave me the idea that I previously mentioned in my previous failure on how to correct that one. So with failure comes learning. So it's not really failure after all. It is just learning how things work and how they don't work. All right, I have started this process again with a lighter hand And I got pretty decent results. It's not showing up super on camera, but there is some leftover haze of embossing powder in the background, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with that. So I did move on to another idea. I'm going to use my anti-static powder very generously to try and prevent that background haze. And I'm going to use a hybrid ink, and that is the Distress Oxide inks. They have some of the properties of pigment ink and some of the properties of dye ink. The property of pigment ink is that it dries slower and it's a little bit more sticky, but not as sticky as the embossing ink. And this has a firm felt pad, which isn't squishing down to hit the background of this plate quite as much. The problem with the felt pad is that you do have to push harder, and only some of the surface of the pad is hitting the plate. But just be patient with it, keep inking, keep inking, keep inking, and eventually I got a good ink coverage. And when I hit it with my embossing powder, it was still wet enough to stick, and I could heat it, melt it, get a shiny reflective finish, which is why I bought these hot foiling plates to begin with, because I like that look and texture to a project. So here you can see it's not perfect coverage, but it is working okay. My advice would be to choose an ink color that's close to your embossing color, and that way whatever background ink shows through, it will lead to the texture of the embossing as well. So I only did half of that as a test, but I really like the mixed look between the embossing and the inking. So that is yet another way to do this. Now, since I was using the Distress hybrid style ink pads that have some of those pigment properties, I went ahead and moved to a full-on pigment ink pad, and that is a white ink pad. However, it was causing some of the same problems that the Versamark ink was causing, meaning it was just a little bit too sticky, and the pad was a little too squishy, so I was getting a lot of stray ink again. So if you have Distress Oxide inks in your stash, go ahead and use those. That wraps up the ideas I have with the foil plates themselves, but I didn't want to leave this video without playing around with the actual foil, because that's the whole point of foil plates, is the shiny foil. Knowing that the foil will stick with some combination of heat, sticky, and pressure, I pulled out my hot glue gun. Now this is a low temp hot glue gun, which as you can see here, I'm having a little bit of struggle with. The glue is starting to dry as I'm trying to squeeze out more glue. Maybe your hot glue gun is better. Maybe you can try this with a high temp. I didn't want to do that because I was worried about burning my fingers. As you'll see, I'll be pressing some things into this hot glue, including the sentiment strip is the first thing. So I lay my foil over that line of hot glue, and then I'm just pressing that sentiment strip down into the hot glue to make an impression. Is it really working? No, because it's not very readable. But here's how I solve that problem. I mount my hot foil plate to a block that I can use it directly as a stamp. I know we kind of mentioned the idea of stamping versus print pulling and things like that, but here I am actually using it as a stamp. And I'm using permanent ink, stays on brand, permanent ink to nestle that image down into the impression I made in the hot glue, and then stamp over it with the permanent ink to get that impression to really show up. And yes, it did work. It kind of slipped and slid a little bit on me and made it a little bit blurry, but not too bad. And it's okay. But through a bunch of other experimentation, I discovered something that I liked better. So I put down a puddle of hot glue and I tapped my foil into it. And then I'm going to use that block to press it smooth and flat. And that is going to create this swath of foiling, which has a much more kind of organic flowing feeling to it. And let me do the peel and reveal and see what that looks like. Okay, and here is what that looks like. It's very mixed media goodness, and so that was really fun. Now, I've done one of these previously without the camera rolling, and here is a look at that one. And you could do this straight on the background of your project, but these are kind of nice that there's individual elements that you can place wherever you want them with no worries about messing up your project. And because these were now flat surfaces, I could much more easily stamp on them with that Versamark ink because these are non-porous surfaces now. We need to use that permanent ink, and it worked beautifully. And in the process of doing all of this, an aha moment struck, and I realized I could hack the heat and still get my foil plates to work. Because I was using the hot glue gun, I realized I have a heat gun for heat embossing, and this did not dawn on me while I was doing the actual heat embossing, but you take the ideas when they come. At any rate, I could put my foil plate down on the same platform, even though it's not getting hot, apply the heat with my heat embossing tool, and heat up my plate that way and continue with the process like normal. And it worked. That's all well and good because I already have this specific platform that creates the correct amount of pressure to go through the machine, but I wanted to come up with a way that anybody could do this. So here's what I did. I took my regular die cutting plates, I put them out on the table like I would for a regular die cutting sandwich, and then I removed the thinnest shim from the sandwich and I replaced it with a metal shim. But that's not all, because we need to make up some more thickness, and we're just going to do that with cardstock shims. Now here's the caveat. Every machine is different. Hopefully your machine allows you to take out a thin shim and replace it with a metal shim. And as long as you can do that, you can add in more thickness with cardstock shims. How many you are going to need, you're going to have to do a test. And I did my test by setting up everything as if I were going to go ahead and hot foil, and then I threw in all of those paper shims. I would recommend starting with just a couple and adding a few more until you get to the point where your hot foil plate is actually pressing an indentation not only into the cardstock that you're trying to make the impression on, but also into at least one of those shims. So don't use any foil during this dry run because you don't want to use it. But here is my dry run where I realized I had enough thickness, because you saw how that cardstock that we want the impression on was sticking to one of those shims. And I had to kind of pull them apart, and you can see the impression in that shim. So I think that means it's a little too much pressure, and I'm going to set that one shim aside. So for my machine, I ended up using 5 shims. With the pressure figured out, the next part of the equation is the heat. I have everything set up here to go with my shims, my hot foil plate, and you'll see in a moment I pull out my foil. Yes, you will need a hot foil plate. I did try this with dies with no luck. There's something different about the metal of the hot foil plate that makes the transfer happen. And you will need some hot foil. But as you've seen in this video, there are other ways to use these products. So if you invest in one foil and one plate, then you can experiment and see if you like this whole process and if maybe you would like to invest in a hot foil machine in the future. All right, this is just a reminder that when you have your foil, you're going to make sure to put the kind of ugly side facing up, facing where our paper is going to be. And so you want to have everything prepped and ready to go before you get started, because this is a little time sensitive. All right, that metal shim is going to do 2 jobs in this whole process. It's going to be a thickness to help provide pressure. It's also a surface for us to heat on. Notice underneath there I have a silicone mat. You can use a silicone mat from the kitchen, or a cutting board, wooden cutting board, or a glass mat. Anything that's heat proof, you can place your metal shim down and then be able to heat on it so the heat doesn't damage anything underneath it. If you're worried about touching everything once it's hot, I found that the metal shim is easy to handle because it's not totally hot. The plate itself got hot enough to burn me, but the metal shim does not. So you can use a little pot holder or some tweezers if you're worried about it. All right, now it took me a while to figure out the timing. With everything completely cold, my heat tool is cold, my plate is cold, I found that heating it up for about 3 minutes got me the transfer that I wanted. Again, your mileage may vary, and I did keep my heat tool moving to try and evenly heat the surface. And I want to get it nice and hot because it will start cooling off as I layer everything together to get it ready to run through the die cut machine. Okay, ignore the fact that my timer says 2 minutes because this was not the final run, but I didn't record the final run. I just wanted to show you the whole process where you have to lay that hot foil down. The curve will soften out as the heat kind of static clings the foil to the plate. And then if you have a nice straight line when you cut your foil, you'll have less of this fussing to do, and that will save you time, which will allow the plate to stay nice and hot as you do this process. So here you can see I transferred the plate and everything over to my die cut sandwich. I put my top plate and those shims on there, and then I run it through. So this is where I do use some tweezers to help me manipulate things and pull everything apart once it comes out of the machine. I do like to tape everything down because that hinge helps keep everything from shifting. And then when we peel and reveal, you can see that I got a pretty good transfer. There are a few spots here and there, especially in the corners and along the edges, that didn't 100% transfer. But all in all, I am pretty satisfied with how it came out. So I hope this idea of hacking your own hot foil machine helps you look at products on the market in an accessible way if you don't want to invest in a machine just yet because you're not sure it's going to be right for you. I know this was a long one, so thanks so much for sticking with me all the way to the end. I hope you got lots of ideas of ways to incorporate hot foil plates into your crafting. Whether you already own a supply of hot foil plates or if you've been eyeing them and weren't sure they were right for you, perhaps some of these ideas will be just the right idea to add these crafty supplies to your routine. I will be back soon with more crafty videos for you, and until then, I hope you have an artful day.